Atheist talk show host mocks Denzel Washington's faith, but something unexpected happened. The studio lights burned brightly above, casting an unflattering glow on David Carson's face as he paced in front of the live audience. His sharp, cutting humor had already warmed up the crowd, and now he was about to dive into one of his favorite targets: faith, or, more specifically, the Hollywood hypocrisy of it all. David's talk show, The Carson Report, had become infamous for its biting commentary, its ability to push boundaries, and most of all, for its brutal mockery of anything deemed pretentious or self-righteous. His audience knew what to expect: celebrity scandals, political rants, and, on occasion, a well-timed takedown of some deeply held belief. Faith, especially in Hollywood, was an easy target. Before we get into the story, comment below where you are watching from today. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different. There was something in the air, a palpable tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. The guest for the evening was none other than Denzel Washington, the celebrated actor known not just for his powerful performances, but also for his outspoken Christian faith. To some, Denzel's displays of religious devotion were seen as sincere, a beacon in the often chaotic world of show business. To David Carson, however, they were nothing more than a well-crafted act, a calculated move to maintain a clean image while continuing to profit from roles that glorified violence and moral ambiguity. As the cameras rolled, David took his seat at the desk, glancing over at Denzel, who sat across from him, cool and composed. The audience, an eager mix of fans and critics, was anticipating a clash, and David, with his usual irreverence, was more than happy to oblige. "So, Denzel," David began with a grin that was more mischievous than friendly, "you're here to talk about your latest film, I assume, but I have to ask, what's the deal with all the God talk? I mean, really, God and Hollywood? That's some kind of divine contradiction, isn't it?" The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the audience chuckled nervously. David's reputation preceded him. They knew what was coming next. Denzel, as expected, remained calm. His expression didn't change, his eyes steady. He had been in the public eye for decades and had long learned to navigate questions like these. He gave a small, measured smile. "I don't see any contradiction in it, David," Denzel replied simply, his voice firm but not confrontational. "It's a matter of who you are and what you believe." David leaned forward, the glint of challenge in his eyes. "Oh, I know. You've said that 1,000 times. But here's the thing. I've seen you play some of the most morally ambiguous characters out there. Violent, flawed, often downright despicable. And then, bam! You're up there at the Oscars thanking God. So, my question is, which one is the real you? The righteous actor or the guy with a gun in his hand, pulling the trigger for another payday?" The room quieted, and David's words cut through the silence like a sharp knife. He was pushing, digging for a reaction. And though Denzel's expression remained unchanged, the air between them grew charged, thick with unspoken tension. David could sense it, and he knew the audience could, too. They were hooked now, waiting for the fireworks to start. Denzel shifted in his seat but did not immediately respond. He was used to these kinds of questions, these barbs that came from people who couldn't understand the nuances of his faith and his work. He had long ago made peace with the fact that his beliefs would be questioned. What he hadn't anticipated, however, was the venom with which David Carson would attack him tonight. David, sensing his moment, pressed on. "So here's my theory, Denzel. It's all a PR move, isn't it? You play the part of the devout man, but it's all part of the image, the brand. Thank God, get a standing ovation, and then make a fortune playing roles that have nothing to do with the message you're pushing. What a con." David's words were sharp, his tone mocking. The audience, now fully invested, was on the edge of their seats. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some seemed to agree with David's take. Others, perhaps fans of Denzel, bristled at the insinuation. Denzel's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but he did not rise to the bait. Instead, he took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. The silence stretched on, almost unbearably long. "David," Denzel began, his voice steady but laced with a quiet strength. "You have every right to question me. But the truth is, my faith is my own. It's not about what others think of it. It's about the way I choose to live my life." The words hung in the air, not as a defense but as a statement of fact. Denzel was not here to justify himself. He wasn't going to allow David to bait him into an argument over something so deeply personal. David, however, wasn't about to let go. He had always prided himself on being a provocateur, on exposing what he believed to be the lies that people hid behind. And in his eyes, Denzel Washington was just another example of someone using faith as a tool to sell a more palatable image to the public. "Come on, Denzel. You're telling me that you're really as pure as you try to make yourself out to be," David continued, leaning in, his eyes narrowing with a challenge. "You've made a career out of playing the anti-hero. You've shown us the darker side of humanity, and then you walk around talking about redemption? You're telling me that doesn't feel fake?" Denzel held David's gaze, unflinching. The audience was holding its collective breath. It was clear that David was going to push him to the limit, but Denzel was resolute. He wouldn't be swayed by mockery or skepticism. His faith was something that could not be shaken by mere words. David's voice took on a more sarcastic tone. "I mean, let's be real here. You're out there preaching about faith, but you're a guy who's made a fortune off of violence. I think that speaks for itself, don't you?" And just like that, the room seemed to freeze. It was as if time itself held its breath, waiting for Denzel's response. There was a momentary pause, a flicker of something in Denzel's eyes that only David could see. A glint of something much deeper than the actor's usual calm composure. "Funny?" Denzel said finally, his voice low and even. "Because that's exactly how I felt about myself once." The room shifted. For the first time that evening, David felt something stir within him, a slight discomfort. It was subtle at first, but it was there. A flicker of something unsettling in Denzel's gaze. The calm, composed actor had just hinted at something personal, something more vulnerable, something that David hadn't anticipated. But David wasn't going to let it show. He was still in control, still driving the conversation. Or so he thought. "You're not going to pull some I was lost and found story on me, are you?" David sneered, his sarcasm dripping from every word. "Because if you are, I think we've heard enough of that already." But Denzel didn't flinch. He wasn't offended. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes now piercing David's with an intensity that David hadn't expected. "No, David," Denzel said quietly. "I'm not going to tell you some rehearsed story, but I will tell you this." The camera zoomed in on Denzel's face. The audience was now hanging on every word. David, despite his bravado, felt a strange unease creep up on him. He had pushed too far, he knew that now. He had crossed a line, but he hadn't yet realized just how far he had gone. Denzel looked David in the eye, his voice steady and measured. "Years ago, in a church not far from here, a stranger prayed for me. A stranger who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. And that stranger was your mother." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The studio had gone completely silent, the buzz of conversation dissipating as everyone waited for David Carson's reaction. But there was no immediate response from him. David's face had gone pale, his usually sharp expression faltering for the first time. His words had been thrown back at him, and he had not been prepared for what he had just heard. For a brief, surreal moment, David thought he might have misheard. But when Denzel's eyes never left his, when the weight of the actor's calm gaze settled over him, he knew it was true. His mother, a woman David had lost to cancer 5 years ago, had somehow been a part of Denzel Washington's spiritual journey. And now, in front of a live studio audience, it was being laid bare. David swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. His defiance was gone. The persona that had taken years to perfect, a persona of intellectual superiority, of effortless mockery, was slipping away, and he felt it. His hand, which had been resting casually on the desk, now gripped it tightly. The reality of Denzel's revelation was beginning to sink in. The audience, sensing the shift, was on edge. Whispers rippled through the crowd, the cameras panning to capture the unexpected drama unfolding. Denzel didn't move. He didn't react to the shifting tension around them. He simply sat there, still as a statue, waiting for David to process the words he had just spoken. David opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the sudden, impossible connection between his mother, his late mother, and the man sitting across from him. It didn't make sense. How could it? His mother had been a devout Christian, someone who lived her life with a quiet but unwavering faith. She had passed on before David had ever had a chance to make peace with her beliefs, or with his own bitterness toward religion. He had long dismissed her faith as something old-fashioned, something he could never fully embrace, and perhaps even resented. And now, here was Denzel Washington, a man who had been the subject of his derision for years, sitting calmly across from him, recounting how this very woman had prayed for him. A woman he had thought was long gone, someone whose memory he had buried in the rubble of his own skepticism, had somehow reached out to a man like Denzel. For the first time in years, David felt his walls begin to crumble. Denzel watched him carefully, as though measuring his every reaction. There was no urgency in his voice, no anger. There was only the quiet strength of a man who had seen much in life and learned to understand that sometimes the deepest revelations come in the most unexpected forms. David shook his head, trying to regain his composure, but the words kept echoing in his mind. Your mother prayed for me. His heart began to race, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I don't understand, David finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. How do you know that? How could you know that? Denzel leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. I've never forgotten that day, he said softly, his tone almost reverential. Your mother, she knew I was lost. She didn't judge me. She just prayed for me. And she told me something I never forgot. One day, you'll help him find his way. David's chest tightened. The weight of those words, the idea that his mother had not only prayed for a stranger but had somehow foreseen this moment, hit him harder than any insult or jab David had ever thrown. The enormity of the situation was nearly unbearable. The bitterness he'd carried with him for so long, bitterness toward faith, toward the idea of God, felt suddenly like a heavy burden he had been carrying for too long. David glanced down, his hands trembling as he tried to compose himself. His mother, the one person who had ever tried to guide him toward faith, had known something he hadn't. She had believed that even someone like Denzel could find redemption, could find peace, and she had believed that he could help David find it, too. The idea was so absurd, so overwhelming, that David felt a lump rise in his throat. He felt both incredulous and ashamed at the same time. He wanted to laugh, to say this was all just a strange coincidence, something that couldn't possibly be real. But deep down, he knew it was true. There was no way Denzel could have made this up. No way he could have known. David's mind flashed back to his mother's funeral. The quiet, somber moments when he had stood over her grave and rejected everything she had believed in. He had dismissed her faith as a relic of a simpler time, something that didn't hold up to the harsh, cold realities of the modern world. Now, the very thing he had discarded so easily was staring him in the face. Denzel's voice broke through his thoughts, soft yet firm. You've forgotten who you are, David. You've buried a part of yourself that you never let go of. The words were simple, but they struck David like a blow to the chest. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't been able to articulate. A longing, a deep, gnawing ache that he had buried beneath cynicism and anger. He had been angry at God for taking his mother from him. He had been angry at her for not being there when he needed her most. He had told himself it was all nonsense. The prayers, the faith, the idea that there was a higher power guiding their lives. But now, Denzel was forcing him to confront a truth he couldn't ignore. He had never really known his mother, not in the way she had known him. He had never understood her faith, and now, in the most unexpected way possible, he was being shown the depth of it. David took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to say something. He couldn't let Denzel's words hang in the air without a response. But what could he say? How could he explain the years of hurt, the resentment, the confusion? How could he explain that he had shut himself off from the very thing that might have healed him? I didn't know. I didn't know she believed that about me, David finally whispered, his voice cracking, his eyes filled with tears, the dam inside him breaking. Denzel nodded, his expression softening. She did, David. And now I think it's time you believed it, too. The words settled between them, quiet and heavy with meaning. The mockery was gone now, replaced by a genuine understanding. For the first time, David felt a sense of connection to his mother's faith, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. The room remained silent, the audience unsure of how to react to the sudden change in tone. But in that moment, David Carson, the man who had built his career on tearing down what he didn't understand, felt something shift inside him. It wasn't the loud, dramatic revelation he might have expected, but it was enough. It was everything he hadn't known he needed. The silence in the room was deafening. David sat frozen, staring at Denzel Washington as though the man had just revealed a cosmic truth about the universe, one that David had spent his whole life resisting. The cameras captured every subtle shift in David's expression. The disbelief, the dawning realization, the raw vulnerability that had crept in unnoticed. In front of millions of viewers, David Carson, the invincible talk show host, was unmoored. It wasn't just the words Denzel had spoken. It wasn't just the revelation about his mother, or the fact that this woman, David's mother, had prayed for a stranger. It was the weight of everything that had come crashing down on him at once. The disillusionment, the anger, the long-buried grief, all exposed and raw in a single moment. And now, as Denzel sat there calmly, the truth was undeniable. His mother had known something he hadn't understood until now. The audience shifted, sensing the gravity of the moment. They had expected a confrontation, an argument, even a fiery exchange of words. But what they were witnessing now was something far more profound, something far less predictable. It wasn't a spectacle. It was a reckoning. Denzel's voice broke the silence once again, soft and steady, a quiet force that seemed to hold the entire room in its grip. She wasn't just praying for me, David, Denzel said, his eyes never leaving David's face. She was praying for you, too. David's breath caught in his throat. The words were like a bolt of lightning, striking him where he was most vulnerable. His mind, already reeling from the revelation that his mother had touched Denzel's life in such a significant way, now began to piece together what Denzel was truly saying. His mother's prayers had not only been for Denzel's salvation, not just for the actor's peace, but for him, David, for her son, who had turned his back on everything she had believed in, who had spent years mocking the very faith she had embraced. David's fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling with a mix of emotions, guilt, confusion, anger, and a deep sadness that he had long tried to ignore. He had never truly understood the depth of his mother's faith, and now it was as if he were finally being shown just how wrong he had been to dismiss it. A wave of emotion surged through him, threatening to overwhelm him. His mother had passed away before they could resolve their differences. He had spent so many years angry at her for clinging to what he saw as outdated beliefs, for not understanding him, for not seeing the world the way he did. But now, in the quiet, still room, surrounded by cameras and an audience that was too stunned to speak, David realized just how little he had known about her, and how much he had needed her. Denzel seemed to sense the turmoil within David. He didn't press further. Instead, he simply waited, his eyes filled with compassion and understanding. There was no judgment in them, only a deep, silent knowing that transcended words. David, still reeling, finally managed to speak. His voice was hoarse, cracking under the weight of everything he was feeling. Why didn't I ever know this? Why didn't I ever see it? All this time I thought she didn't understand me. I thought she was naive. His voice trailed off, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. I was so blind, Denzel. Denzel leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. That's the thing about faith, David. It's not something you can always see. It's not something that can be measured by your own standards or your own understanding. But it's always there. And sometimes, the people you think are the furthest from it are the ones who understand it the most. David shook his head, a slow, painful realization settling in. She was always trying to help me. She never stopped praying for me. And I never even gave it a chance. I was too busy being angry, too busy thinking I knew better. His hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. She must have been so disappointed in me. Denzel's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on the desk, as if to offer some grounding in this turbulent moment. She wasn't disappointed, David. She loved you. She always did, even when you couldn't see it. That's the thing about love, it doesn't depend on whether you believe or not. It's there, even when you're not ready to receive it. David looked up at him, his eyes full of unspoken pain. He could feel the weight of Denzel's words pressing on him, forcing him to confront the ugly truth he had spent so long avoiding. He had been wrong. He had shut himself off from his mother's love, from the possibility of faith, because he didn't want to be vulnerable. He didn't want to acknowledge that the very thing he had mocked could actually hold the answers he'd been searching for all his life. The room seemed to close in on him, the weight of the realization nearly suffocating. The years of anger, of deflecting the pain by mocking faith, by mocking what his mother had held dear, all came flooding back at once. And now, here was Denzel Washington, someone who had been a stranger to him just moments ago, sitting across from him, offering him a chance at redemption, at healing. And yet, David couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late. Too late to apologize. Too late to fix what had been broken. You've spent so long hiding behind your cynicism, David, Denzel continued, his voice gentle yet resolute. But I'm telling you, there's more to life than just fighting it. Sometimes, the answers you need come in ways you don't expect. Through people you didn't think you'd ever meet. Through moments you never saw coming. David was silent, processing everything Denzel had just said. He wanted to lash out, to push back, to find a way to make this feeling go away. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Not anymore. The walls he had built around himself, the armor of defiance and intellectual superiority he had so carefully crafted, were crumbling piece by piece. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, David spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do with all this. I don't know how to go back. How do I make peace with this? Denzel smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that was full of empathy. You don't have to go back, David. You just have to move forward. The weight of Denzel's words hit David with the force of a revelation. There was no going back. There was only forward, toward a future that wasn't burdened by the past, toward a faith he had rejected but could now embrace on his own terms. For the first time in years, David felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a grand, earth-shattering revelation. It wasn't a sudden miracle, but it was enough. It was everything. The silence in the room lingered, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of possibilities. David Carson had begun his journey towards something new, something he had never expected to find on a talk show set, with cameras rolling, in front of an audience who had come to see a spectacle. Instead, they had witnessed something far more profound. They had witnessed the moment a man had been awakened, not by an argument, not by mockery, but by an unexpected truth. The tension that had hung so heavily in the studio during the earlier exchanges had shifted. What had started as a fiery confrontation, a test of wills between David Carson and Denzel Washington, had dissolved into something far more personal, far more vulnerable. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure of how to respond. The cameras, trained on the two men, captured not the usual banter, but something that was deeply human. A conversation stripped of pretension, of anger, of deflection. It was just two people, both broken in their own ways, now connecting in a way neither had expected. David's mind was spinning. Every word Denzel had spoken seemed to echo inside his head, replaying in loops. She told me you'd forgotten who you were. Those words had cut through him with the precision of a blade. He had spent so much time burying his past, ignoring the very things that had shaped him, that now, in this moment, he was faced with the harsh reality of it all. His mother, whom he had once resented, had always known that David's path was not as clear as he had wanted to believe. She had always seen him as someone who was searching for something deeper, even when he refused to acknowledge it. The pain of those years, of losing her without ever fully understanding her, began to surface in ways David had never anticipated. He thought he had it all figured out. He thought he could move through life dismissing the things that didn't fit neatly into his worldview. But now, sitting in front of Denzel, he realized just how much he had missed. The moment stretched on, unbearable in its intensity. David looked at Denzel, still sitting across from him, unwavering, calm. Denzel hadn't moved since his last words, as though he had no expectation of anything more from David. And yet, David felt the weight of Denzel's gaze, the weight of what it meant to truly see someone. David opened his mouth, but no words came out. He tried again, but still nothing. It was as though his throat had closed off, his ability to speak or even think clearly vanishing in the wake of everything he had just learned. The silence between them was thick. It was the kind of silence that filled every corner of the room, weighing heavily on everyone present. David could feel the eyes of the audience on him, waiting for him to break, to say something that would explain what had just transpired. But there were no easy answers. There was no convenient response that could make sense of the flood of emotions he was feeling. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into an abyss, not knowing whether to jump or pull back. The vulnerability he had so carefully protected for years had been exposed. And for the first time, it wasn't a mask. It wasn't a performance. It was the raw truth of who he was. Denzel, seeing David struggle, leaned forward slightly. There was no rush, no urgency in his movements, just a calm, almost paternal patience. He had spoken his truth, and now it was up to David to process it, to find his own way through the maze of pain, loss, and confusion that had defined his life for so long. "I've spent so much time," David started, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time pretending I didn't need any of this." He gestured vaguely toward the cameras, the studio, the whole spectacle of it. "Pretending that I was above all this. Above faith. Above belief." He paused, swallowing hard as the weight of his own admission hit him. "And now, I don't know what to do with it." Denzel nodded slowly, understanding the depth of the conflict David was facing. He knew that these things couldn't be resolved in a single moment, that true change didn't happen overnight. But he also knew that this was the beginning of something David had been too afraid to confront. His own need for healing, his own desire for redemption. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, David," Denzel said quietly. "This isn't about having everything figured out. It's about being willing to take that first step, even if it's a small one." David looked at him, the layers of cynicism and resistance that had built up over the years starting to peel away. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, David wasn't sure of himself. He wasn't sure of the answers he had clung to for so long. And that uncertainty, it wasn't a weakness. It was freeing. The walls he had constructed around himself had been strong, but they had also kept him from understanding anything outside of his own narrow perspective. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was as though the world had paused, allowing David the time and space to process what had just happened. The flicker of vulnerability that had crossed his face earlier had not been lost on him. And in this quiet moment, David understood that he was at a crossroads. He could continue to deny the truths that had been laid bare before him, or he could choose to face them, to let them guide him toward something greater than the bitterness he had carried for so long. His thoughts drifted back to his mother, to the prayers she had said for him in the quiet moments of her life. She had never forced him to believe. She had never demanded that he follow her path. But she had always believed in him, even when he couldn't see the worth in himself. And now, in the most unexpected of ways, he was beginning to see the love and the faith she had so freely given. David looked down at the desk, trying to steady his breathing, trying to regain control over the emotions that had overtaken him. He felt something stir inside him, a quiet spark of hope, one that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. For the first time in a long time, David allowed himself to feel the pain. The pain of losing his mother. The pain of the years spent fighting against what he couldn't understand. And in that pain he found something unexpected. Healing. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, steady process of confronting the truth. Denzel didn't speak. He didn't need to. He knew that the silence was doing its work. It was giving David the space he needed to come to terms with what he had heard, to reflect on his own journey, and to finally see the truth of his mother's love, not just as a belief she had carried, but as a gift she had left for him. The studio had become a sacred space, a place where two men, one searching for redemption, the other offering it, had found a moment of understanding that transcended everything they had known before. The silence that had settled over the room began to grow heavy, as if it too had taken a deep breath, holding its collective exhale. David sat across from Denzel, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. He could feel his body trembling, not from fear, but from something far more overwhelming. The floodgates that had been holding back a tidal wave of emotions were slowly beginning to crack. It had been a long time since David had allowed himself to feel anything deeply. The years of deflecting, mocking, and pushing away the things that made him uncomfortable had built walls so high he had almost convinced himself they were impenetrable. But now, as Denzel's words echoed in his mind, "You've forgotten who you are," he felt those walls begin to crumble. David closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, but it was no use. The dam inside him had broken. He felt it in his chest, a tightness that constricted with each breath. It wasn't just the revelation about his mother. It wasn't just Denzel's calm presence, forcing him to confront his own weaknesses. It was the weight of everything. The years of lost opportunities to make amends, the resentment he had carried, the pride that had kept him from seeking redemption. It all came crashing down on him at once, a wave so powerful it threatened to drown him. A sob caught in his throat, and David's body jerked as if someone had struck him. It wasn't the dramatic, controlled breakdown one might expect from a man of his stature. No, it was raw. It was messy. It was the kind of breakdown that happens when a person finally admits to themselves that they are human, and that their own pride and bitterness have kept them from healing. David squeezed his eyes shut, trying to hold back the tears, but they came anyway. He couldn't stop them. He wasn't sure he wanted to. The audience, who had been watching with bated breath, remained silent. They, too, could feel the gravity of the moment. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was real. This was a man, broken and vulnerable, finally allowing himself to feel everything he had buried for so long. The cameras continued to roll, but no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the world had stopped just to witness this moment of profound vulnerability. David's hands trembled as he wiped his eyes, but the tears kept coming. The tears for his mother. The tears for the years he had spent pretending he didn't need anyone, pretending he had it all figured out. He had spent so much time building up this image of who he was, of who he wanted people to think he was, that he had lost sight of the person he actually was. And now, in front of millions of viewers, he was faced with the truth. He was just a man. A man who had hurt, who had been hurt, who had sought answers in all the wrong places. Denzel sat quietly, watching David, never once looking away. He didn't speak. He didn't offer any words of comfort. He just let David feel it all. Let him release the years of pent-up frustration, the regret, and the deep loneliness that had defined so much of his life. There was no rush, no need to fix it. It was all part of the process. David took a shaky breath, trying to compose himself. His face was flushed, his eyes red from the tears that had come unbidden. He looked up at Denzel, his voice still trembling, but steadying with each word. "I didn't know how much I needed this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know how much I needed to hear this. All these years I've been running away from it. From her faith, from everything she believed in. I thought I was better than it, better than her." Denzel nodded, his expression softening as he saw the sincerity in David's words. He knew that David wasn't just speaking about his mother's faith anymore. He was speaking about his own life, the choices he had made, the path he had walked. And now he was finally starting to face it. "You're not better than it, David," Denzel said quietly. "You're not better than her. But you don't have to be. You just have to be yourself. The real you. Not the version you've been pretending to be." David's heart tightened as he listened to Denzel's words. The truth was simple, almost too simple. But it was something he had spent a lifetime ignoring. He had been so caught up in the world's expectations of who he should be that he had forgotten the person he had always been beneath the layers of cynicism and pride. He had forgotten the man who had been loved, who had been cared for, and who, despite everything, had always wanted to believe. "I don't know if I can ever make up for the years I've wasted," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever make things right." "You don't have to make up for it, David," Denzel replied, his voice calm but resolute. "You just have to start now. That's the thing about redemption. It's not about fixing the past. It's about choosing to do better with the time you have left. It's about choosing to walk a different path, starting today." David nodded, the weight of Denzel's words settling in. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't have the power to erase the mistakes of the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could take the first step. He could start by accepting who he was, by acknowledging the pain and the loss that had shaped him, and by being open to the possibility of healing. He looked at Denzel, the man who had been nothing but kind to him, who had seen through the walls he had built. And for the first time in a long time, David felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a grand, life-altering epiphany, but it was a start. It was enough. "I don't know where this path is going to take me," David said, his voice steady now, the tears finally subsiding. "But I'm willing to walk it. I'm willing to try." Denzel smiled, a quiet, understanding smile. He didn't need to say anything else. The moment had passed, and now David had a choice. A choice to move forward, to stop running, to finally face the things he had been avoiding for so long. As David sat there, the weight of the conversation still heavy in his chest, he realized that this was the first time in years that he felt free. Free from the chains of pride, free from the anger that had defined his life for so long. He had taken the first step toward healing, and that, in itself, was something worth holding on to.